Local productions seen on Delta College Public Media are made possible with support from viewers like you. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Mike Redford, and this is the follow-up. Coming up on tonight's show, a conservative supermajority on the U.S. Supreme Court has renewed a national debate fueled primarily by the White House and Democratic leaders not happy with recent rulings by the High Court. Should we add more justices, something called court packing, or should justices be required to retire at age 70? Plus, the first sitting U.S. cabinet member in nearly 150 years facing impeachment charges. Will Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas face trial in the Senate? And we'll break down the litany of criminal and civil cases facing former President Donald Trump and what impact it might have on his chances to reclaim the presidency. Two political science professors are in-house tonight to discuss it all. But first, we would like to hear from you to help drive the conversation here on the show. You can do that by social media on Facebook. You can email us, you can dial into our follow-up hotline to voice your opinion or suggest future show topics. And you can comment on YouTube as well. And if you'd like to watch any of our past shows this season, just log on to deltapublicmedia.org. Our guests tonight, two regulars here on the follow-up, and we're glad to have you back in studio with me, Julie Keil, a Saginaw Valley State University political science professor. Nice to see you.
Thank you.
And dialing in remotely, Ryan Petersen, political science professor from Delta College. Nice to see you again, Ryan.
Good to see you, Mike.
So let's start with the Supreme Court. They have this supermajority on the High Court, 6 conservative judges, 3 of which, or whom, were appointed by former President Donald Trump. White House not happy with many of its recent rulings, reversing Roe versus Wade, rolling back affirmative action laws, rulings against student loan forgiveness, banning states from removing former President Trump from the presidential election ballot. Goes on and on. So President Biden and other Democratic leaders are again talking a little bit about adding justices, so-called court packing, requiring justices to retire to age 70. What do you make of that, Julie? I'll start with you. And could it happen? What would that really sort of mean long term?
Well, I mean, they tried it back in the 1930s during President Roosevelt's time and the New Deal. And very conservative Supreme Court was, voting against everything that or not voting against, but deciding against everything that that Roosevelt was trying to do. So he attempted court packing back then. What happened back then, though, is that the Supreme Court actually realigned itself a little bit, became a little more reasonable, and eventually people dropped off and things changed and worked a lot better. So that might happen here too, but unfortunately, most of President Trump's, most of his appointees are pretty young, and so the chances of them dropping off anytime soon are pretty small. I think the oldest currently of the 6 is, Ryan may know this better than I do, but I think it's either Alito,
Right.
Justice Alito, or it is Justice Thomas. And they're not all that old.
Yeah, I was going to say Thomas, but
Well, it's
He's
another
been
case
there,
of-
he's been
yeah,
there
I
the
think
longest,
if FDR couldn't pack the court, I don't think anybody can at this point. It is the case that the size of the court is not determined by Article 3 of the Constitution. That is set by Congress and the president. But right now, the House is controlled by Republicans. There's no way that they're going to approve any bill to alter the size of the court. Democrats have the narrowest of majorities in the Senate, so I think you would have enough senators who would defect on principle and not support that. Biden, at least, was on record as being opposed to packing the court simply because I think he recognizes that it's just going to lead to, a kind of one-upmanship, right? If the Democrats try to pack the court, then Republicans will do the same, and you go from 9 to 12 to 15 to, when does it stop? So, in practical terms, I think it's something that whoever is on the losing side of Supreme Court decisions at that moment in time likes to think about and talk about and point out that, hey, this is constitutionally possible. But the political reality is right now, it's not going to happen. You would need overwhelming majorities of one party in both houses to make that happen.
I think I agree, Ryan. The problem is that the Supreme Court's been moving steadily to the conservative side more and more. So what, like 20 years ago, it's a super conservative is actually kind of a liberal or almost moderately liberal position right now. And so I can see the interest in packing the court or doing something to change this. But I think I agree with you that the votes just are not there to just make this kind of a change to the Supreme Court.
No.
If Roosevelt couldn't do it, I don't think that Biden can do it. On the other hand, it's possible.
Right. Think about how big think how big the majorities that Roosevelt had in Congress were. I mean, there's a point where Republicans were down to, I mean, I want to say it was like 20 senators, something like that. I mean, just huge majorities, and he couldn't pull it off then. So with an evenly divided House and Senate, it's just not a realistic possibility at this moment in political time.
It may not be in terms of votes, but I'm not so sure if it is in terms of the fact that the issues are different than they were back then. It was mainly economics. And today, things that are being decided by the Supreme Court are a little more integral to people's beliefs. Mm-hmm. So but it's going to take some time. I don't think President Biden could ever do it.
Well, sure.
But it might take time and do it over a course of maybe in the next 5 to 10 years, but I think it's highly unlikely as well.
Yeah, let's talk about some things that they're going to be ruling on that are in front of the Supreme Court. Staying on that vein, I guess, one has to do with states trying to keep former President Donald Trump off the ballot, saying he was an insurrectionist, resulting in the January 6, 2021 Capitol riot. The justices a few weeks ago ruled unanimously that the states can't do that. So what are your thoughts on that? What went down?
Well, I think that's the only choice they could make, honestly, because if they had taken him off the ballot and he had lost the primary and had not been the Republican choice, and then the court had later decided that he should be on the ballot, then we'd have to have the election all over again. So I don't think they really had a choice about that. What's going to happen later may be different, but I think for right now they had no choice about it.
Ryan, any thoughts on what?
Yeah, I think I said the last time.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
No, you're right. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think I said the last time I was on the show that, I predicted that the court would rule in Trump's favor on that particular case, that regardless of what you think of Trump or his actions on January 6th, there was just, to my way of thinking, no way that in the absence of a criminal conviction or some sort of overt act, that a state official would be found to have the authority to remove a candidate for president from the ballot.
Right. Another case involving Trump in front of the Supreme Court has to do whether or not a president should have complete immunity from prosecution due to the things he did as president, related largely to his actions that led to the January 6th Capitol riot. A grand jury and the U.S. Court of Appeals have ruled he should not be immune from prosecution. Any thoughts of what the High Court might do if they do rule against him? What's the impact if he's convicted of this criminal case?
This is a complicated case. This is way past simple discussion. On the one hand, you'd like to think that if he's committed, which we all believe, at least I believe he's committed an act of insurrection.
It's a strong case.
It's a pretty strong case for it. But on the other hand, you have to have some limit as to what you could do, because third world countries had these kinds of charges against their presidents, and they take them out of office and put somebody else in office, install somebody else in office. So you set up this precedent where somebody does something you don't like, then that means you can then charge with an insurrection and have them be removed, and then put somebody else in their place, and that starts to stop the will of the people and democracy from occurring. So I'm concerned about that, but on the other hand, the things he's done, I think he does not deserve immunity for some of them at least.
Well, I would say that, first of all, it's not about, in some sense, what ought to be the case or what he deserves, but rather what the Constitution, what sort of immunity the Constitution does or does not confer upon him. And I think the idea that a president has absolute immunity it flies in the face of the entire purpose of the founding of the United States. A British monarch literally is the sovereign. I remember once trying to explain this to some students of mine, and I had a student who said, "So wait a minute, this is back when Queen Elizabeth was still alive." Said, "So the Queen is above the law?" And I said, "No, she is the law." We rejected that over 200 years ago, and I think I think Trump is going to lose on this particular case. He got a win in the ballot case, and I think that was somewhat predictable. But in this case, I don't think there's any way that the court is going to find that he has the kind of absolute immunity that his lawyers are claiming he does.
Yeah, I think the problem is with the word absolute. So the court may decide, well, he doesn't have absolute immunity, but he has immunity from certain things. And does that thing fall? So, like the time he was, fomenting insurrection or whatever after he was after the election, before he left office, was that part of those times he's immune or not immune? Is that part of the actions of a president for making sure the government is actually having an election that's a valid election? So, do you get immunity for that or not get immunity for that? So it may not be a complete lack of immunity, a complete immunity. Something in between is going to happen instead. I'm not sure what that's going to look like.
Yeah, and speaking.
Yeah, I mean, I think.
Go ahead, Ryan.
Yeah, I mean, clearly, I think presidents have to have some kind of limited immunity while they're sitting in office regarding their official acts. So then, as I think you correctly point out, is what he did on January 6th, does that constitute any kind of an official act? I think that's highly debatable, particularly given that in our system, it's the states that conduct elections. We don't really truly have a national election, not even for president. What we have are 51 separate elections, the 50 states and the District of Columbia, and it's left up to state officials, state and local officials to conduct those elections. And then ultimately for Congress to be the judge of the results. The president has no constitutional role in determining the outcome of the presidential election. So I seriously doubt that they're going to find that those were official acts on Trump's part.
But are you concerned about the current makeup of the Supreme Court and maybe being able to finagle that a little bit to find a little wiggle room on it, though? Because that's where my concern is. Well,
I'm really not. Call me naive, but I believe that the primary differences between the justices are in their interpretive philosophies, which are obviously very different. They have some very profound and fundamental disagreements about what the role of the court is and how to interpret the Constitution. But the idea that the justices will simply rule in favor because Trump appointed them. I think we haven't seen that thus far, and I don't think we'll see it in this case.
Well, I wasn't thinking about just because they've selected him or he was selected by him that they would definitely do that. But the conservative viewpoint on things is not going to be so crystal clear to say this is so simple. This is clearly no absolute immunity, and these things are not part of that immunity. I'm still concerned that there may be some issues, but maybe not everything. So we may be able to catch him on a few things. I'm not sure the insurrection issue is necessarily going to get to the full term, I guess. I think the presidential documents thing after office is the clearest thing. It's a criminal offense he could be charged with.
No question about that.
Pardon?
You said no question about
that. No question about that. I think that one's an easy one.
Is open and shut as they come.
Yeah, I think that's an easy one because that's clearly not part of a president's ability because he's left the office at that point. So that one should be clear.
So on that line of discussion, we've got a list of sort of the litany of civil and criminal cases that the former president is facing. Of course, depending on what side. He's got an election case in Georgia, trying to overturn it there. Charges filed in the January 6th case, classified documents case, which Julie, you just mentioned. He's got the Manhattan hush money case that had to do with Stormy Daniels, and a few others that we just mentioned it here on the immunity and some other things. So he and his supporters have said all along, it's all politically motivated, both in terms of their validity and questioning the timing with the cases being delayed until, how convenient, to the middle of a presidential election year. So are any of these cases that he should be more worried about, Julie, or you talked about the documents case. That's the one that maybe will rise to the surface beyond some of the others?
Well, I think the Stormy Daniels case is one that clearly is not part of his job as a president. So, that one, immunity makes no sense to that case whatsoever. Right. But I think it's less dangerous than the documents cases because for people having classified documents being held secretly and then hiding them, it's like Richard Nixon all over again, basically. The tapes and all the rest of the things he did. It seems so simple. But I think that the documents case is one I'd focus on the most. The Georgia election case is just a mess.
Right.
So many charges, so many defendants. There's just so much that's going to go on. It's going to take forever to try that case.
Right.
But the other two cases might make it before the election. I guess we'll see. Is it based on the election coming up and partisanship? Who knows? These cases started before, like a year ago. It's been a long ongoing battle.
So what's interesting, and Ryan, you can probably weigh in on this. I mean, not too long ago, if somebody was running for president, you could have 1/10 of what former President Donald Trump is facing, and they'd be done. And yet, he continues to thrive. His base seems to love it, and he's not going anywhere, right? I mean,
Yeah, that's why it's so hard to make predictions, I think, when it comes to Donald Trump and his candidacies. He could be convicted of a felony, and this could potentially help him politically. And as you said, in the past, the tiniest thing could derail a presidential candidacy. And I think back, I'm 51 years old. I think back to all of the candidates who had their campaigns derailed when it came out that they were having extramarital affairs, or in the case of Howard Dean, simply made an overly exuberant, yeehaw on live television, and your candidacy was done. And now it seems like, at least with Trump's base, the tolerance for these sorts of things is much higher. I also think this explains why, in some ways, Trump's political and legal strategies have really merged into one. Ordinarily, I think when a presidential candidate or a politician is involved in some kind of legal trouble, I think very often their political advisors are telling them one thing and their lawyers are telling them another. In this case, I think that the two have merged for Trump, and his last best hope is to win the election, in which case he can appoint an attorney general who can make these two more serious federal cases go away. So his legal strategy is now a political strategy.
Yeah, it's also part of, he has a bit of a fascist bent to himself. And part of fascism is being able to create so much chaos that people can't keep ahead of things. So the more charges he has, the more chaos that happens, the more he gets press, gets up in front of people, he gets a chance to inflame his base. So he's really out of the fascist playbook right now. If you look at things that have been done by Lenin, things that have been done by Putin, he's fitting some of those same patterns. And it seems to be working because people are picking up in that chaos and enjoying it and inflaming their views on things.
yeah, and that divisiveness and what we're talking about, how things have changed. You look at what's happened in the media in the last 20 years, particularly social media. It's just crazy. Nothing shocks you anymore. So a lot of people look at this and say, okay, well, that's no big deal. I heard about that the day before. I mean, the media sort of played into it too, right?
I would have thought the Stormy Daniels hush money thing would have been enough. That,
right.
People should have looked at that. If you're a Christian, if you're an evangelical Christian in particular, you should be looking at that and saying, why would I vote for this person that has that kind of behavior? And instead they sort of seem to celebrate it, and it's disturbing.
Right.
Yeah.
We have this
20 years ago, that would have ended anyone's presidential campaign.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we have this thing called separation of powers. I'm going to touch on this for a moment. Executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government. We've been talking about all three in our discussion tonight. It's a system of checks and balances, so one branch can't go rogue, so to speak, right? Each branch has certain powers to keep the others in check. Yet in this divisive culture, the system is sort of, I don't know if it's teetering, but it's certainly being questioned. When one side or the other doesn't like the outcome of something, we need to change the rules. We need to change the Constitution because this just isn't fair. We could get into many examples, but any concerns about this separation of powers? Will it continue to stand the test of time? It's been standing for 150 years plus. I don't know.
I'm a bit of a pessimist, so I actually don't think it's been standing for 150 years. I think it's been teetering a lot.
Okay.
Because we've had times when Richard Nixon's a prime example of having, a super majority in both the Senate and the House. Richard Nixon was able to, push his own agendas fairly easily. We've had earlier presidents been able to do that as well. Separation of power, separation of the power and state and checks and balances are not necessarily a given, even in the United States. Yeah. So I'm not sure this is unusual, but not that unusual.
Yeah. Well, when I look at some examples, like in 2016, Hillary Clinton lost to Donald Trump, and her side's up saying, well, we got to get rid of the Electoral College. That's not working anymore. So that's a constitutional change. You hear that a little bit.
Yep.
Then, of course, with President Trump, challenging the 2020 election, citing conspiracy theories. He wants to overturn the election because he didn't get his way. President Biden is vowing to take steps to reinstate Roe versus Wade, try to circumvent that decision. President Biden was able to sort of provide student loan forgiveness, even though the Supreme Court said, no, you really can't do that. There just seems to be this, if you don't get your way, there's no accepting the outcome anymore. So
I don't know that that's that different. I think
Okay,
it's been going
all right.
on. I think that's been going on for years. It's just it's out there because we actually watch it now.
yeah,
The social media again and the media in general point out all these things on a regular basis. We're exposed to this. I don't know that it's all that different.
okay. Some things have not changed.
Ryan may disagree with me on that. I don't. I think it's
Yeah,
gotten
I
more
mean,
extreme.
I think there's a little more of a sense maybe right now, right, that if my side doesn't win, then it was rigged, then the system is broken, then something needs to be changed. I'm concerned that that is dangerous in a democracy. That in a democracy, both sides have to be willing to accept that you win some and you lose some, and it's not. It's not a situation where it's fair if you win and it's rigged if you don't. So I think that that's a real problem. I also think, I mean, and this has certainly happened before in our past. I mean, we're living in hyper partisan times right now, and I think part of why you might see a breakdown in the separation of powers is because partisanship really supersedes now loyalty to branch of government, which is something the framers counted upon in order for the separation of powers to work. If everybody is more concerned and more loyal to their party than they are to their, we're talking about elected officials now, than their particular branch of government and holding on to its rightful powers, then the separation of powers will cease to function properly.
Yeah. It was just interesting, if you watched the State of the Union recently, President Biden kind of took some shots at the Supreme Court justices, and there were 9 of them sitting pretty much in the first and second rows, and they just kind of looked at him and didn't say a word. I mean, if looks could kill, it was just, so it brings up that issue just a little. It's a lot. It's a little of that going on. Before we finish up tonight, I want to talk about the U.S. House sent 2 letters of impeachment against Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas to the U.S. Senate for consideration. It'll happen next week on the 10th. He would be the only second sitting cabinet member in history to face impeachment charges, first since 1876, when the Secretary of War was tried but acquitted. What do you make?
It's insanity. It's insanity. I mean, the person back in the 1800s who was the Secretary of War who was impeached, I mean, he clearly had been involved in benefiting from war and receiving money and all sorts of grants and trust and whatever. And so he clearly was somebody who should be impeached. Impeaching Mayorkas makes no sense. And I kind of go back to this. I just want to pull this out. The founders actually fought over the idea of what actually should be impeachment. And they tried to figure out what the kinds of crimes you could commit which would be impeachable offenses. We've impeached a lot of justices over the years. Judges have been impeached 20, 30 sometimes in the last couple hundred years. So that's relatively common. But originally they thought about having people being impeached for malpractice or neglect of duty, and that seemed like that was pushing too far towards the legislature having power over the courts or over the executive branch. So they thought about this, and they later changed the wording to treason, bribery, or corruption, but that didn't work either. So they finally ended up with it being something that involves high crimes and misdemeanors. Now, so somebody like Mayorkas, who's being charged with having not done something they wanted to have him do, how is that a high crime or a misdemeanor? I mean, a misdemeanor is going to be relatively minor, but the things he's being charged with are ridiculous. They don't fit the definition of an impeachable offense in any way, shape, or form.
Right. Want to weigh in on that, Ryan, in terms of impeaching? I mean, one thing.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, where is the treason, the bribery, or the high crimes and misdemeanors here? Subjective disagreements with someone on partisan issues does not constitute grounds for impeachment. And I think that this is, we've sort of crossed the line here into a purely partisan act. And there's a certain irony here in that House Republicans also failed to pass the border immigration bill, which potentially would have given Secretary Mayorkas the tools that he needed to do a more effective job. So the same people who prevented that bill from becoming law, that bipartisan bill, that came out of the Senate, they're now going to blame someone else, for failed border policies.
It's an election year, so of course they're going to do that because it's a chance to slam one party for not having done these things and impeach somebody rather than trying to fix the problem yourself. And I mean, we put people in Congress for the purpose of legislating, and then they don't do any legislating, and then we accuse people that are not legislators
Right.
of malpractice or malfeasance, and it's just it's ludicrous.
Right.
They don't have the Senate votes for it anyway. They're not even going to have a hearing on it.
Yeah, it's not going to go anywhere.
It's not going to go anywhere.
No,
Yeah.
they'll-
So they've just wasted our taxpayers' money and our time again
Yeah.
for something that's not going to happen, and it's an election tactic. It's nothing
Where would
else.
Nixon have fit in with that impeachment kind of definition, I guess? Huh?
High crimes and misdemeanors. Seems like breaking into the Watergate.
Yeah, Watergate Hotel.
And hotel and hiring former military people. Clearly that's a high crime and misdemeanor. That seems like fairly simple.
Right.
But he walked away from it because he resigned, and of course Trump is never going to do that, and I don't think Mayorkas is going to do it either.
No, and I was going to mention here.
Nixon also pretty explicitly used the powers of his office to try to obstruct justice as well,
absolutely.
to prevent Congress
Absolutely.
from finding out. So
Yeah.
Right in line with that. I mean, I was going to mention that both Presidents Clinton and Trump were impeached. Both remained in office. So impeachment really, does it ever have any serious consequences? You mentioned the Secretary of War 200 years ago. Other than a person's reputation is dragged through the mud and it's a waste of time and money.
Well, and he resigned. The Secretary of War, he resigned and cried and resigned and walked away from it, and nothing ever happened to him after that. He just lost his job. And President Clinton, he was not impeached. He was never removed from office because the Senate didn't have the votes, and with President Trump, he didn't have the votes either. So engaging in these things, when you don't have the 2/3 vote you need to have an impeachment go through, and actually for the person to be convicted is just it's all show.
Right, but at least the Senate next week, I think, at least has to take it up because
Yep.
the House sent them the 2 letters,
Yep.
so they have to kind of go through the motions,
Yep.
and they can either say this is nothing, or we can do a trial.
Well, they have to have 2/3 the vote, and they don't have the votes
Right.
because even if you just look at the Republican majority, they don't have the votes, and it's a
Yeah.
minority in the Senate.
Well, politics as usual, and I appreciate both of you coming in and doing this little political science roundtable. It was a lot of fun. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
We'll do it again down the road. Thanks, Ryan. All right.
glad to be here.
And that's our show for tonight, but be sure to join us again next Tuesday night for the follow-up. Local nonprofits are teaming up to grow and strengthen diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts right here in mid-Michigan. In the meantime, hit me up on social media or dial into our follow-up hotline. We'd really like to hear from you. Thanks for tuning in tonight. Have a great night. We'll see you next Tuesday night.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And make sure to click that bell icon to stay notified when we upload new content. Videos like this are only possible because of viewers like you. To help support this channel, click on the link in the description below. We'll see you next time.